The Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARPA, has put out a warning that mosquito-borne diseases continue to be a serious public health threat in the Caribbean. You hear that word? Threat. Dr. Horace Cox is the head of vector-borne disease with CARPA and the Assistant Director of Surveillance, Disease Prevention and Control. And he joins us now via Zoom. Morning, Doc. How are you this morning?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm doing fairly well, thanks.
Wow. All right. So we had a list up on screen, but just to be underscored by you, when we say mosquito-borne diseases, exactly what diseases are we referring to?
Excellent question, and pleasant morning to your audience as well. Just to note that when we speak of mosquito-borne diseases, as the name would suggest, it means any disease which is transmitted by a mosquito, which is termed a vector, meaning that you have a pathogen or a disease-causing organism, and when that organism comes into contact with the vector, which is the mosquito in seeking a blood meal, then bites a human being, and in that process is able to transmit the disease-causing agent to the person. So the number of diseases that we consider, we can go through an inexhaustible list, but I know the audience would be able to relate to quite a number that we've heard of in the Caribbean region. For example, dengue, chikungunya, Zika, malaria, and there's some new ones that are coming on the scene as if we hadn't enough to deal with. Just imagine we've been talking about Oropouche and Mayaro in our settings. So to be honest, it's a lot. And I know persons are a bit more familiar with ones like dengue, as I mentioned, but some of the new and re-emerging ones like Oropouche, they're reason for some concern in the Caribbean region at the moment.
How do those old ones come back, or how do we get new variants, for want of a better word, Doc?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the reality is that we're never quite out of the woods, as persons like to put it. And the reason for that is that patterns change. So you have several changes. And what I should explain to the audience is that whenever you have a disease, it's really the result of a human being, especially vector-borne, in contact with a vector in a given environment, all right? And so what's happened is that several of those factors would have been changed over a period of time. For example, we've been hearing of climate change in some settings. I know sometimes when persons go out there like, wow, this place is hot. I don't quite recall this place being so hot. The nights are much hotter. We look at the natural disasters which are occurring across the region. This year, for example, only recently, and I do, reach out to the audience regarding the aftermath at Beryl, because I know Jamaica was hit to some extent. And the reality is that natural disasters are occurring to a larger scale. And with those changes that we're seeing, we see that the vector is being able to adapt. And the vector is finding that the environment is more conducive to its reproduction and proliferation. And as a result, as well, because of hotter temperatures, you find that the pathogens are going through their life cycle much faster and can infect persons in a much stronger way. And notwithstanding, as you know, the world now is a global village. Today we can be in Jamaica and we can be in China by tomorrow. So the reality is that that's just to illustrate the point that travel has increased to the extent that, people are moving from one place to the other. So when you have diseases that could be spread by vectors that are found in environments that are becoming more conducive to disease transmission, you can really see that there's an increase, all right? And in the midst of everything around climate change and the adjustments to temperature in different settings, you really have what is called all the right ingredients to make the wrong dish.
Yeah.
Right? So we really want to appeal to the audience that now is a time to be really concerned and a time for us to ensure that we do all that we have to do on a personal level and at a community level.
Doc, I'm curious. You named 2 additional diseases that are totally, I've never heard of them in my entire life. And one of the things I wanted to ask is, what are the differences in terms of symptoms of those, or are they similar to any of the others that we already are familiar with?
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's a good question, because I imagine right now the audience are like, well, tell me how I can know whether I have this or not.
Yes.
And the reality is that lots of them, because they're termed arboviral diseases, and the reason for that, meaning that they're spread by arthropods, a lot of them have similar characteristics. For example, you'd find fever, headache, illness, general ill feeling, etc. But the reality is that there's some distinguishing features. For example, when we look at dengue, there's a certain way in which the rash would appear. When we consider chikungunya, a lot of persons would recall from the chikungunya outbreak that we had across the region dating back to 2015, that the joint pain can be quite intense. And even afterwards, some persons still experience joint pains. And so, for example, dengue, you can also find that there's a retroorbital pain, or to put it simply for the audience, there's that eye pain that, tells you that perhaps this is something we ought to consider. But the reality is that the constellation of symptoms, you can find any group of them across the different diseases. And as if things weren't complicated enough, when we consider Zika, you find that in Zika, it's difficult to detect because you can have about 80% of the cases which are mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic, meaning that people present with no symptoms and they could be infected. Thankfully, we're now going through that explosive outbreak of Zika as we had in 2016. But the reality is that it can be very complicated. But generally, if we were to orient the audience, we would want to tell them, look, anything with rash, anything with fever, anything, if you were to have conjunctivitis, red eye, any of those things, or even if you're feeling ill generally, be sure not to take it for granted and go to the health facility and get the care that you deserve and that is available for you.
So let me ask you, is this particular to our region there, Doc? Because I'm reading now that CARFA is saying that there is a 200-fold increase in suspected dengue cases in the first half of 24 compared to prior year period. That's just dengue. What else have you been seeing with the others that you mentioned? And is this like endemic to our region alone, or is this something that is concerning people worldwide?
This is a very good question, and the reality is that it's not only endemic to our region. It doesn't only affect our region. And in fact, the reference that CARFA made to the 200-fold increase in dengue cases is really a global reference. This is what, or perhaps a larger regional reference, meaning the region of the Americas. It's in a report by another public health agency that in the region of the Americas, that would include South, Central, and North America, you have suspected dengue cases that have increased 200-fold compared to a similar period last year in 2023. So that's just to put things into context. And last year we saw dengue outbreaks across the globe. So the reality is that the factors that are influencing these dynamics are factors not only present in the Caribbean region, but also further afield in the region of the Americas and even globally. But the reality is that CARFA's interest is mainly the Caribbean region, and therefore our duty is to ensure that we put a message out there that will reach the people of the Caribbean, inclusive those that are in Jamaica, and ensure that they're aware of what needs to be done. So the reality is that as persons would know, only recently we were in the public health emergency state of dealing with COVID-19. And we all remember with some level of trauma or the other, the difficulty that we had. So we must never forget that these diseases can one time be not of concern to the general public, and another time they can really get out of hand. And therefore, the appeal to the audience is to ensure that we do all the basics right. And what would the basics include? For example, in and around our homes, for example, those places where water supply might not be as regular, and speaking generally to the Caribbean, I know persons like to store in the black tanks and in the buckets, and persons have their flower vases, etc., in and around the house. All those receptacles that store water, we need to ensure that those receptacles are covered and that they don't allow for breeding of the mosquito. There you have on screen, very good photo of a tire. Some persons may have used tires in their home. Those might not be perforated, and you find that the water would collect in the tire and can allow for breeding the mosquitoes. And you'll see different types of receptacles. So it's about appealing to the audience. Yes, there is a mandate that needs to be executed by the Caribbean Public Health Agency. Similarly, a mandate is being executed by the Ministry of Health and Wellness within Jamaica. But having said that, there is also a mandate which must be executed at a community level, which remains with the general public. And that mandate is to ensure that you and all of us, we do our bits and pieces in terms of ensuring that we limit the number of breeding sites and eliminate them from our homes and our communities, and thus ensure that all our loved ones are not as exposed to these diseases as would be the case if we don't do what we should.
Okay.
All right.
Doc, well said. Thank you. That those who have ears to hear, hear what Doc is saying this morning. Head of Vector-Borne Diseases with CARPHA and the Assistant Director of Surveillance, Disease Prevention and Control, Dr. Horace Cox. Thank you, Doc, for checking in with us this morning and for giving
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Life-saving information. After the break, Jamaican Iko Jones goes US Volleyball Pro. Soon come with that.